Hello everyone, today we are going to talk about Darkest Dungeon 2, my opinions of what changed in the video I did before this. So I'm going to name this part 2, my opinions. If you're not sure what changed, you will obviously be able to tell by the video, but I'm not going to go as in depth per se on like all of the exact changes. I'm going to highlight a couple here, and I'm going to put this probably over older gameplay footage. I'll probably mix around a couple of the styles I'm going to talk about, but for the most part, I'm just going to have old footage off and talk about what's changed and maybe compare to it what was in the magazine here. So I'm going to have about like 4 things I'm going to really highlight. It's structure of the game, heroes, mechanics, and then just kind of the stylistic stuff. And I'm not necessarily going to go in that order, but those are probably going to be the 4 biggest points I chronically come back to. And I'm going to once again give my opinion if I think it's good, if I think it's different, if I think it's going to change, or if I genuinely think it may have been a step back. And other stuff that is purely opinion based. So let's just get started. So first, let's talk about how the game's actually going to be set up now. The fact it's going to be more of a traditional roguelike, like Slay the Spire or Faster Than Light. To me personally, that is not necessarily my cup of tea. I would have much rather seen it still be a roguelike with permanent choices, but take it at your own pace, so to say. Because I'm not a huge fan on the idea of chronically being forced to go forward and forward and forward. What I would have liked is, I don't mind the fact that they have a 5 structured act that you have to progress through. I don't even necessarily mind that they made it a 5-act story. What I would have liked was each act you kind of had a chance to move onwards. Maybe like defeating the boss would progress you. So you could get people up to levels to defeat the boss and then move on and not be able to go back. I would have been okay with that. At least that gives you a style of pace, but also kind of locks you into that forward progression. But how they have it right now is you just essentially sprint for 7 to 9 hours and then you're done. My main fear about that is replayability. Typically, not always. Games like that, they're really fun for maybe the first 4 playthroughs, and if they don't have enough differences every time you start, you're going to run into a lot of issues. So I am a little nervous about that being more of a traditional roguelike without having benefits each time you go. Because they say it's going to take on average 7 to 8 hours. Well, they say 7 in the article, I believe. I'm just going to give 9 for like the first, 9 to 10 for the first run. Because, you know, you're going to be kind of like, oh, I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm reading the skills. I'm reading the, you know, it's going to take you significantly longer the first time through. But typically with roguelikes, it's a skill by quantity, essentially. The more you experience and the more you play, your time essentially accelerates. So I would not be surprised eventually if runs were 5 to 6 hours. I honestly would not be. And if you can do a run in 5 to 6 hours, I don't know the quality in which you can expect. The reason why roguelikes are, I guess, see, this is where my opinion comes in. I'm just not a huge fan of roguelikes. And I think roguelikes get incredibly boring quickly. I think they lack content because nothing can change. I think they lack what they actually wanted to do was a story, because the problem is it finishes so quickly, and what actually did it really well was Hades. So if Darkest Dungeon 2 pulls off a Hades, that'll be really good. And the reason for that is Hades has a story outside of the actual dungeon runs. So if Darkest Dungeon finds a way to chronically, when you finish a run, to have something change in the background or something, where heroes change, something like that, each time you go in, that'd be nice. But if you constantly start from nothing, finish the game, just to jump back to the beginning, just to do the same thing, I feel like that's going to be maybe, for the casual player, 20 to 30 hour game at max, and then you're done, right? You're going to beat it 2 to 3 times and be like, well, alright, I beat it 3 times, there's nothing else to do, I've done my hero combos, I've seen the relationships, I'm out. That's 30 hours. And the other, well, in Darkest Dungeon, 40 to 50 was like my first one, and I think I even sunk more hours into my first playthrough than that. So that's where I'm saying there's a potential if they don't do it correctly. Now, I don't know exactly how they're going to do it, so I'm not saying it is 100% going to be bad, but I do think there's a strong potential that this could fizzle out after a couple of runs, despite the fact that they think they're giving you more quality over quantity. First Darkest Dungeon, definitely grind heavy. But I feel like they may have gone almost to the extreme head where they said, don't worry about grinding. We're just going to shove you through, give you what you need, simplify the fighting so you can finish in 8 hours. I don't know if that's exactly what Darkest Dungeon should have done. But we'll see. Maybe that's actually a really good thing, and we just don't know it yet. So let's talk about the heroes and the skills and all this stuff. And I think they actually added some pretty cool stuff here. This is where I'm a little more uplifted on, to say the least. I'm going to like the fact that characters are going to have a lot more, I guess, personal interactions, I'm going to call them. They're going to be much more like individual based, class based. They're going to interact on classes a lot more than they did in the first one, which is really cool. So I'm going to give them props to that, and that alone may, and I'm going to say may have the capability of making those 7 to 8 hour runs worth it in terms of quality. Now, the downside of this is, and I've done a little, like super little bit of programming. So since they added that level of depth between characters, you're obviously not going to be able to have a lot of characters or heroes, hence why they just said you can only have one of each class. I am absolutely not a huge fan of that. I think that is single-handedly a destructive decision for the pure fact that this game is going to get extremely formulaic and quickly, I believe. I think there's going to be, with only 9, sorry, man, I've been screwing that up. With only 9 players coming out in early access, I'm willing to bet there is only a combination of 4 to 6, and the other 3 never get used, really. The fact that you are stuck to having one unique of each, and only having the cultist as the potential healer, which means you're probably always going to have an occultist or plague doctor, and then the other 3 are going to be whatever, where you might have an occultist and a plague doctor. Now you're down to whatever 2 are, and if the Hellion's not great at damage, you might legit be stuck with a highwayman, occultist, and plague doctor every time, and then you just rotate out between a jester or a man-at-arms. And jester, depending on what they do with him, he may not even be good anymore because they got rid of accuracy, which we'll talk about in the mechanics section. So I'm a little nervous that they may have killed the levels of creativity which you could have had with party comps, because at one point, and once again, I'm not harping on the director or the designer of the game, whatever this Barasa guy, I think it's Barasa, whoever this Barasa guy is, but he keeps saying stuff about the old game, which was like some of my favorite parts, which just confuses me if they actually knew what like a, how do I want to say it? If the heart and the majority of the community, and I might be an outcast, well, not an outcast, but a loner on this, I feel like mixing and matching as many as you want and the party names, like it was fun putting multiple of the same hero in. Could it technically get broken with a few people? Yeah, like 2 highwaymen. Yeah, if you just want to shred every dungeon, you put 2 highwaymen, a Vestal, and then whoever in the front row, and you just do a riposte cycle and you just lawnmower whoever you face. Yeah, I mean, it gets broken pretty quick. But for the most part, you can't do like the fools rush in anymore with 4 jesters. And they even mentioned a point about Rot Squad in here. They say you don't have to see what 4 lepers looks like. I have one of the most fun times sticking 4 lepers together and just getting them obliterated in a dungeon somewhere. I mean, they did god-awful terrible, but I had so much fun. And I think that's the real crime. I think, and I'll just say it now, I think Darkest Dungeon 2 is going to be Darkest Dungeon Simple. It's just going to be, I think they got scared from the criticism of the first one, which I don't understand why they may have listened to it. And once again, this is all speculation. Who knows? This could have been their plans all along. They could have said, I don't care about the criticism. This is the path we always wanted to take Darkest Dungeon. We just didn't have the design time, people, or the mechanics. You know what I mean? So I am assuming, I don't want to ever say this is definitely what they did because I've never talked to anybody. I just read this article. I'm just trying to infer from the article what it appears to do, well, appears to be what they have done. Because some of the biggest negative reviews on Steam are these two to three things. Grind heavy, absolutely agree. They got rid of that. RNG, they are effectively destroying that. And then C, tough game mechanics to understand and utilize. Effectively in Darkest Dungeon 2, they have decimated all 3. They have made it super simple, which simplicity is beautiful until you realize that the old Darkest Dungeon, though many mechanics were added and some can sound initially complicated, what made Darkest Dungeon complicated was adding all of these simple mechanics together and making a great team. The mechanic of accuracy was simple to understand. The mechanic of dodge was easy to understand. The mechanics of HP and critical were all super easy to understand. But combining all of those together to optimize those in a team and picking among 17 unique characters with their skills was the difficult part. It wasn't that the hero skills required an encyclopedia to understand how they played. They didn't have big words or 19 different effects that you always forgot. Everything was very simple, but Darkest Dungeon was built on a simplicity that you could use those simple blocks and create a masterpiece, if I had to say the least. It seems like Darkest Dungeon 2, they give you one big block of simplicity and say, this is your game. It sounds like they're taking away the other blocks and saying, build a game. You're like, I have 4 blocks compared to the 20 I had in Darkest Dungeon 1. How am I supposed to do anything unique and beautiful with 4 blocks compared to the 20 I had in the first one? Now, once again, that's an opinion and a perspective. It could very be that Darkest Dungeon 2 is actually way more tactful, way more unique, and way more strategizing than the first one. But I am weary that removing certain game designs and putting them as tokens and removing certain aspects such as armor and accuracy is going to simplify the game a lot. And it does feel like the game was going towards almost like they wanted people to play this on a mobile phone where, it was only going to take you 7 to 8 hours to beat. You could play it like on a subway for an hour to 2 every day. You could get through it by the end of the week. It doesn't look or feel like a strong computer game, if I have to be honest. I know I've been rather harsh, and I maybe haven't highlighted the things I'm actually really interested in. I will get there, but these are the things that bring to the forefront my most concerning of questions. Now, to give some praise, I think driving the Caravan wagon thing is going to be awesome. I think if they do that right, going from place to place is going to be fun, as long as you're not just holding W and maybe your people talk on the way as well. If it is just merely the new dungeon path you have to navigate through, I don't know if that's going to be particularly fun. It's just going to be a stupid thing where you have to hold W and move forward. But judging by the magazine shot, it looks like it's going to be a little more different than just randomly holding down W for a walkway like you sometimes do in a dungeon. So I'll give them credit on that. It looks pretty cool. Some of the visual stuff they've changed, such as your hero getting their knife out, getting ready to wicked slice. I personally could not care less. I'm not saying it ruins the game. It's just, I don't know if that's something I was particularly yearning for. And maybe I don't know that I even wanted it. It's one of those things. Sometimes you don't even know what you want until it's created and added, right? Because when people progress things to life in games, sometimes they add things where you're like, oh, I would never even thought of that. And you start playing, you're like, how the heck did I play the first game without it? You know what I mean? It's kind of like, for example, just not to get off on a side tangent, but when some cell phones, and actually majority nowadays, don't have the headphone jack anymore, it's one of those things where people are like, it doesn't have a headphone jack. Well, for the most part, I don't hear too many people really complain anymore. Everyone's on board with the Bluetooth, you know what I mean? Someone created something and moved it towards a direction where there may have been initial pushback, but for the most part, the rest of society and people that use those products just kind of accept it and move on or even like it more. So, like I said, it very well could be. A lot of these changes in Darkest Dungeon 2 are actually for the better, and I'm just entrenched in about 500 hours of gameplay on the first one, so I'm having obviously an initial gut reaction of I don't know if I like this because it's not really Darkest Dungeon. I'll make a point at the end about that idea, but for the most part, we're still going to focus on my opinions and actual gameplay changes. So another thing is the trinkets. I'm kind of sad that the trinkets are going to be random based, and it almost feels like if you don't get certain trinkets, your run's not going to be over, but it's going to be significantly harder. And I think that is actually one of the weaker parts of roguelikes, where if you don't get the item you need, it's not a run killer, but you're like, oh, this is going to be a lot tougher. I hate when trinkets are overpowered, or if there's one trinket that you have to depend on for one character. If you don't get it, you go, well, I'm not using them this run. I would absolutely hate to see that happen. No character in the first Darkest Dungeon was useless if you didn't get a trinket you wanted. Now, there was some that were weaker than others, but for the most part, you could take a character the whole way through if you wanted. But in this one, at level acts 4 and 5, if you need a character with a certain trinket and you don't have it, you go, well, I can't use them. That's not great game design. That is just limitations. Yes, I have to default learn how to use 9 or 10 heroes based on necessity. But I don't think it's good game design that you say you can't use a character because you didn't get a trinket. I think that's kind of garbage, kind of lazy, to be honest. And it takes maybe potentially one of your favorite characters and makes them useless, all for the sole fact of RNG. So they were trying to get away from RNG, but then they almost fully embraced it if trinkets are going to be the only thing that keeps certain heroes moving forward. So I'm not sure if I'm going to be a big fan of that. It may not be that bad. The trinkets may be Though they may be stronger, they may not be game-breaking like they're saying they will be. So we have to wait and see how it goes. But that is one of my initial concerns about the trinkets. I will be interested, though, in what other trinkets they do and stuff. That'll be pretty cool. I'll be interested in how they do preparations and gold and all that. But we'll see. Some of the screenshots do confuse me. It looks like even gold is rather simplified. It looks like it's not going to be thousands and thousands. It looks like you might get these little chips along the way, and we'll see how those interact. Now, let's get to I know I'm already like 15, 16 minutes in. Let's get to the very glaring thing. The art style. I, for one, and probably with other people, it looks super mobile. Not that mobile is necessarily bad in every scenario, but it definitely looks like you should be playing this game on a phone. I don't know how else to say it. It feels very phone driven. Iratus, Lord of the Dead, suffered the same thing. I didn't exactly love Van Brace's art style either. And once again, they really focused on the smaller heads thing. I do not care about a smaller head. Like, I don't know. It helped me identify characters easier when they had the bigger heads. I mean, now that I know them so well and they're bringing back 8 of the original, and that's not to say they won't bring back more of the original as they slowly release more stuff. I'm just not a huge fan of the art style. I think it looks, to be honest, I think it looks a little gaudy. It looks a little too shiny at moments. So it looks a little fake. Like, it's because it feels so more, I don't want to say realistic, but it feels so more arted up. I don't know what the word is for it, but it looks so design heavy that it doesn't feel rugged anymore. It feels like everyone's kind of clean. All their clothes are like super tight fitting, no rags. I don't describe it. They just feel too clean for Darkest Dungeon. So it's not that the art style is going to ruin anything, but it is off-putting, and I'll get past it. I just don't know if it's something they had to focus clearly so much time on. And as I said in the article many times, they were really, really bothered by the initial art style in the first game, which boggles my mind because I thought they did an excellent job in the first one, but they clearly did not think so. And I gotta admit, that is one of the biggest surprises of this whole article, is them thinking it's just not good enough. And kind of wrap up my opinions on this. We've hit on a lot, and there's so much more to eventually go through. I didn't even talk about like the breakdowns and all that stuff. Not breakdowns, meltdowns. For the most part, the meltdowns are part of the relationship. They're kind of like afflictions. They reset things. That's fine. That's a normal game mechanic. I'm glad they kept something like that in there, so we're not really going to go over that too much. The last thing we're going to talk about is having 5 abilities on and tokens. 5 abilities, that's why I am super nervous. It's going to be solely just 4 or 6 characters are the only, 4 to 6 heroes are the only good ones. Because now that you can have on so many skills, it's going to limit the need, I think, for other people. Because what that's effectively going to do is the first Darkest Dungeon, you can only have 4 skills on, right? So people couldn't have everything on. They couldn't be a catch-all, so to say. 1 extra skill is a huge deal in my mind. It's a huge deal, honestly, because now it might be like, now my damage dealers can set themselves up and have all the normal damage potential. Or my healer can now heal, but also have a variety of great stuns and pulls and stuff. Where now my leper can finally have every damage, moving ability, whatever have you, and still have self-heals. It just feels like a couple of characters are just going to have literally everything. There's not going to be a lot of justification to maybe have other characters other than those relationships. So that's just my 2 cents on that. And then the whole token system, it sounds like protection, increased accuracy, maybe, I'm not sure. Increased critical chance were only criticals. This is, like I said, this is the stuff I have no idea on. We have to play it to see what it is. And then it sounds like blight, bleed, I think I said protection, but block, and dodge. I think those are like 7 of the mechanics starting to get tokens. Not to be a Debbie Downer or a wet blanket or any other things you want to compare to. I think the token system is kind of generic and dumb. I think it simplifies the game too much. I think they could have easily have kept some of those as basics. I I have no idea why they decided to add block tokens that didn't block all the damage. I don't know why they felt that crit tokens were needed, where dodge tokens were needed, and the fact that they got rid of accuracy. I think, honestly, those were terrible things to get rid of. I know people don't like missing, but it's the fact that misses, or not building towards a miss, really changed how you developed your party, right? For example, in the first game, if you had like a 89% chance to always hit with something, you're like, this is going to work 9 times out of 10. Now it's just going to work 100%. And I'm afraid of how the game designers are going to correct for that. And also, now there's really appears to be no heavy dodge strats or like reduce enemies' accuracy stats. So I'm very curious if it's just going to become a generic, either put a dodge token on somebody or put a protection token on somebody. Like, I'm very concerned the combat is either going to be convoluted because there's so many stupid tokens to worry about now, or it's going to become so simple and formulaic because there's no other way to do X, Y, or Z. You know what I mean? Because if you're like, oh, I need a dodge token before we fight because I can't ever dodge on this character, it removes some of the angst when you know your hero's on death's door and enemy attacks you. It's like, am I going to dodge? Now it's just like, oh, enemy attacks me, death's door, okay. Like, that's so boring. It's deflating. There's no angst. There's no preparation. You can't predict it. In the first Darkest Dungeon, you could take the same fight a million times, and no matter how good you were at the game, sometimes you'd get your crap wrecked in because it wasn't formulaic. And I'm afraid this game is going to be formulaic. That's mostly my rant. And just the one if you've made it this far, kudos to you. The last thing I'm going to talk about is I'm a little concerned they called this game Darkest Dungeon. And not because they didn't add Darkest Dungeon elements. They have the skin of Darkest Dungeon, but they do not have the gameplay. They do not have the depth or the style of Darkest Dungeon. This would essentially be like, I don't want to say it. I'm trying to think here of a good example. This would be like a first-person shooter. And then the next game, it becomes like a third-person shooter with like a lot of weird added elements or something. It's hard to come up with an example, but they kind of stayed in the same genre. They kept the same names of characters and ideas, but they've totally changed the mechanics. So it's tough to say. Thank you for watching. Like, there are things I do absolutely think are going to be awesome about Darkest Dungeon 2, and I'll end this video on a more positive note. I think the relationships are going to be awesome. I really do. I think it's going to add a lot of memorable moments, which is great. I think there was a benefit to making things shorter. I'm just worried it might be too short, but I do appreciate the shorter time. Having less trinkets that are better, I think, is it's good. It's great, because 90% of trinkets in the last game were utterly useless, so reducing them to useful ones, absolutely amazing. And it might be cool to have 5 skills on to set up some pretty sick combos. So the rest of it, we'll have to see. We know nothing about bosses. We know nothing about enemies. We know nothing about the wagon. These are all things that could be extremely awesome and help easily tip this game into from concerning to, what was I ever saying? This game is just great. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And stick around for more Darkest Dungeon 2 content.